Good afternoon and welcome to the second session of Camp Prosperity 2023, Breaking Through the Noise, Strategies to Amplify Voices in Advocacy. My name is Justin Chu and I will be your first host for today's session. Before we dive on into the conversation, a few housekeeping tips. This webinar is being recorded and will be mailed to registrants and available online within 1 week. All webinar attendees are muted to ensure sound quality. But ask a question or share your thoughts anytime by typing into the text box on your GoToWebinar control panel. If you experience any technical issues, please email gotomeeting@prosperitynow.org. And here's the way to get the most out of today's call. Join us from a quiet space, grab a coffee or snack and settle in. And we really want you to engage with us. Send us your questions and comments as you listen. You can share those on GoToWebinar, or you can tweet with us on Twitter using the hashtag #CampProsperity. We'll also be posting on our TikTok and Instagram, so we highly encourage you to check both of our platforms out on both of those two social media platforms. And finally, the thing we want you to take with you is reflect on ways to apply in which what you learned today to your own work. On the next slide, there are prizes for this engagement. Tweet and take our surveys to win prizes. We want this to feel as interactive as possible. So we've included several ways for you to win prizes throughout the series. During each session, we'll award a prize to the top tweeter. So live tweet using the hashtag #CampProsperity. And also please complete the post-webinar survey for a chance to win a prize. Last week, Mike from United Way of West Florida won our social media contest, and Sarah from Southwestern Community Services won our survey contest. So finally, one of our goals is to better prepare our network of advocates to engage legislators. We are encouraging everyone to meet with a state or local legislator on issues of housing or child wealth building policies like baby bonds between now and August 31st. And if you do so and fill out our meeting logger, which you'll find in the chat, you'll be entered to win a complimentary registration to next year's Prosperity Summit. So you don't want to miss out, and it's a great way to get involved with your local policymakers. All fields in the meeting logger must be completed to count as an entry, and we'll announce the winner in early September. And now we'll move on to today's speakers. First, we have Vanna Cure, Associate Director of Advocacy from Prosperity Now, Kelly Garcia, Director of Policy at the National Institute for Reproductive Health, Don Owens, Vice President of Communications and Community here at Prosperity Now, and Sarah Miller, Senior Policy Analyst at the Hope Policy Institute. For today's agenda, we'll kick off with a few poll questions. We'll do a little bit of a presentation, and then we'll go into a more informal fireside chat, talking about the strategies and amplifying voices and creating a strong messaging campaign. And then we'll have a little bit of a discussion and question and answer. And then finally, we'll have a bit of next steps and closing. So before we dive into the first bit, we want to have a little bit of a poll question. So the first poll question is, what is your experience level when it comes to messaging for advocacy? Please select one of the following options, either beginner, intermediate, or experience. And we'll leave this poll open for a few more seconds as folks begin the voting process. I'm glad to see these numbers ticking up and really excited to share some of these insights and get a chance to know you a little better. All right, and we'll close that out and share the results. So it looks like the vast majority of you are beginner or intermediate, with only 7% of you ranking as experienced. So we hope that this training will be a great place for you to learn and build those skills. And hopefully by the time we meet again next year, you'll feel a little more comfortable to take another step up in this poll. And next, I want to go to the second poll question, which is, who is your primary audience when it comes to messaging? Again, this is only going to be one response, and the responses are legislators, funders, clients, media, or other. And if you hit other, please feel free to put it into the questions box so we get a sense of who your primary audience is. We'll give just a few more seconds to let people vote, and then we'll share out the results. All right, closing the poll now. And it looks like For about half of the attendees here, clients are your primary audience for messaging, and then legislators and funders are a very close tie for second, and they make up these three top groups make up the lion's share of the primary audience for messaging. So this is good to keep in mind and good to understand who your primary audience is as you explore messaging and media strategies. Speaking of, I'm going to turn it over now to Don Owens, who will be doing a presentation on messaging and media strategies. Don?
Thank you, Justin. Good afternoon, Camp Prosperiteers. It is a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I want to first, before I get into my short talk here, to say thank you to you folks and congratulate you. Most people are taking their summers to relax, rest, recharge, take some time off. You folks are actually taking the time to improve your skill, meet other advocates, and pick up some knowledge. And that can be very hard during the summer because people need to recharge to get ready for the rest of the year. So it's admirable that you folks are here and picking up some new knowledge. And of course, we are just incredibly happy to have you. And again, it's my pleasure to be here. I want to start off today when I talk about messaging from my experience in my career by telling you a story about Oklahoma. About 20 years ago, I worked on the advocacy and the media side in the early childhood education and pre-K advocacy field. And as a DC-based group who re-granted money to states, we often flew to states to work with our local partners to talk to state legislators about increasing funding for pre-K programs. And one of the states we were heavily interested in was the state of Oklahoma. So we went to Oklahoma City. And while we were there, Oklahoma then, as now, is a heavily Republican state, a conservative state. And they don't always put the most funding, resources, or support into education programs writ large and pre-K programs individually. However, the irony in that is Oklahoma was one of three seminal states that did some of the earliest longitudinal research on the importance of early childhood education and pre-K. So we targeted them as a state where we needed to move legislators. And so we flew there that day to meet with legislators, most of which who were Republican and conservative and not necessarily predisposed to supporting our issue. And while that morning we were going to meet some legislators, we were on the elevator. And on that elevator was my boss, the executive director, a local lobbyist we had hired and contracted with, and a local advocate who carries out some of the duties many of you do, working with clients, working with funding groups, and working within their communities. While we were on the elevator, this state senator stepped on the elevator. And as you can imagine, he might be your prototypical state senator in Oklahoma. He had on cowboy boots, a nice suit, and a cowboy hat. He stepped on the elevator in front of the four of us. He chose his button. And right before he got to his floor, he sort of overheard the conversation we were having about early childhood education, pre-K, and advocacy. And as he stepped off of the elevator, he turned around and faced us. And he put his right hand on the door of the elevator to make sure the doors would stay open. And he said, "I've been listening to you folks. Let me ask you a question." And he directed these words towards my boss. She looked like our boss, so naturally he would talk to her. And he said, "Why should I, as a state senator, support your issue? Why do you do what you do?" And my boss, Libby Doggett, looked at him and she said, "Senator, you should support pre-K because it's a proven solution. It benefits all children, and you cannot improve K through 12 education in the state of Oklahoma without investing in pre-K." And the state senator nodded his head and said, "Thank you," right before the doors started buzzing to say you had to close. And he didn't realize it at that point, but we certainly did. We had just given that state senator the foundational messages of how we explained our issue, whether we were talking to a funder, whether we were talking to families trying to access high quality early childhood education, whether we were talking to lobbyists or new advocates we were trying to bring into our movement. And we smiled on the elevator as the doors closed and we went to our floor to meet with the other state legislators because we knew we had honed our messages. We had created messaging materials to prepare for that moment, that 20 seconds we had until the doors started buzzing for closing in the state legislature in Oklahoma, that if we ever get asked that question, we have to have an answer that is concise, that is quick, that is direct, can easily be understood, and that a state legislator could walk away after hearing it for only 20 seconds and possibly repeat it themselves. Benefits all children is a proven solution, and you cannot improve K through 12 without pre-K. That was a foundational message that made it into all of our materials, all of our letters to the editors, all of our op-eds, all of our brochures, some of our funding materials, some of our speaking engagements. We began with those messages, and when we closed out, we ended with those messages. Benefits all children, proven solution. You cannot improve K through 12 without investing in pre-K. That's what I'd like to talk to you about today in the few minutes we have together, that you've got to bring to your work if you're not already doing it. And as we move to the next slide, after I've told you about Oklahoma, I'm going to talk about the 4 elements of effective messaging. What you see on the screen now is the idea, the broad idea of the approach we took at numerous nonprofits that I've worked at when we develop our messaging. So before we start writing and word crafting and thinking, what do we want to say? We start with these 4 basic principles of how we want to arrive at effective messaging. And those things are 4 very quickly. Your messaging must be relevant. Your messaging must be repetitive. Your messaging must be exclusive, and your message must be simple. And so I'm going to go over those 4 things now. Relevance. That's very easy to understand. You've got to talk about things and message about things that relate to what you do. Let me give you an example. 10 years ago, I worked for another advocacy organization that advocated for Social Security, expanding Social Security benefits for the elderly and children. And for those of you who don't know, Social Security is the nation's largest children's program, because there are more children on Social Security. If you lose your parents, lose your caretaker, lose a grandparent who is a primary caregiver, you get Social Security until you're 18. So we saw a reporter in the Washington Post who had done a story talking about funding within our nation's budget and how much money we were spending in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, and trying to build an American-style social insurance program. And so we saw that story and we thought, man, we need to find that reporter. Let's create a 2-page white paper and target it towards that reporter. We might get a front page story. And then if we get the front page story, we'll attract the eyes of funders. And if we attract the eyes of funders, more advocates are going to want to work with us and partner with us. And if the more folks want to partner with us, then maybe a US Senator will invite us to one of their events where we can talk about our issue. So we came up with a 2-page white paper talking about the amount of money we were spending in foreign policy and how that might bolster and be redirected if we spent that kind of money on our own issues in the United States for our Social Security system. And we sent that pitch and that research paper to the reporter, and we got no story. We got no coverage, no traction. And a few weeks later, I reached out to that reporter and I said, hey, we saw some of the stuff you wrote, and we thought this document we sent to you would be perfect and right up your alley. And he said to me, Don, it just didn't seem relevant to what you guys do. You advocate for Social Security on the domestic scene, and you're sending me a research document talking about international relations and international funding and local and intermixed with domestic funding. It just didn't seem relevant to what you guys did, so I didn't write about it. So think about that in your messaging. You want to be expansive, you want to be creative, but you also want to talk about issues and things that are relevant to what you do and what you advocate for. Repetitive. That's pretty simple. You want to talk in a way about the issues you advocate for in a way that can easily be repeated. And if you can't do that, then it's a reminder. We've got to work with our communications team. We've got to work with other advocates. We've got to possibly go back to people who used to work with you and say, hey, we're looking for ways to refine this language, because we know that the way we talk about it at this table can't always be translated outside of our walls. What are some words that we need to eliminate? What are some words that we say that we think are normal that maybe we need to stop saying outside of these walls? So make sure it's repetitive. Third thing, exclusivity. Being exclusive. This is particularly important for those of you who are advocating for issues considered human good, community good, progressive issues. And that, I would gather, or most people on this call, if not everyone, no matter your political backgrounds. You've got to choose messaging and issues that are exclusive to you. Now, here's why this is important. All of us belong to groups where we end up working in coalitions. We work with big coalitions because coming together, we can garner more attention and speak with one voice. But even with those efforts of working in coalitions, you've got to make sure you are adhering to messaging and advocacy principles that highlight the exclusivity of your nonprofit, of your group, of your issue. It's sort of like that old saying, if you have two friends and they agree on everything, then one of you is not needed. That's why you've got to maintain the exclusivity of your messaging. And the final thing, simple. Relative, repetitive, exclusive, and simple. Make sure that the messages, the wording, ideas that you're taking outside of your office, outside of your group, are simple, reduced to their simple form. And I know that's difficult because we deal with complicated issues that have different funding streams, that have different aspects and communities that have to be considered. But you've got to work and ask yourself at the end of the day, we've worked on the relativity, the repetition, the exclusivity, but is this simple to be understood? And if it isn't, consider who your audience is. So as we move to the next slide, I want to talk to you about how you can arrive at those 4 elements of effective messaging. And that is working with your groups to create what's called a message box. Now, I'll give you a warning at the beginning. You may see what I'm about to say and think, well, we need to create a message box for every issue we work on. Don't do that. First, work on creating a message box for the basic idea behind the advocacy that you do. It could be young children, it could be Social Security, it could be early education, it could be women's maternal and child health. Create a message box generally for why you come to work every day. Why do you advocate for this issue or issues? So don't try to create this for every specific issue unless you have one main thing. So let me tell you first what a message box is. A message box, and I'm going to read this because it's important to remember. It's used to focus spokespeople and advocates on core messages by providing a set of clear, concise statements that are backed up by pertinent information. And I want to focus on that last part, pertinent information. A lot of folks who work in the policy realm, who are specifically dedicated to lobbying or lobbyists, will say some of these things can't be boiled down to simple things. And even if they were, we still need the research and the longer form writing to back up those messages. I agree wholeheartedly. And you're going to see in the next image, we don't need to move yet, but that I'm going to show you, you're going to arrive at simple messages that are backed up by the research and the talking points that make your work possible. These core messages should be a part of every interview, just like I said in my first slide, every publication, every action the organization carries out, because you will find that those people who follow you, those people who support you, those people who want to get involved in your work will start repeating your messages without you having to say them. So remember that about the message box as we move to the next slide. What you see here is something that came out of probably mid to early 1990s, political messaging on campaigns. Campaigns needed an idea to say, hey, how do we talk about this candidate? How do we talk about the issues that are important to us? They created a message box. How do you get started creating your message box? We could spend a whole afternoon showing you how to do this, but in the 2 minutes I have left, I'm just going to walk you through really quickly how to begin working on your message box. And maybe down the road, work with some of the other folks in your networks or contact the communications team at Prosperity Now, and we'll work with you to help you arrive at a final message box. But how you start this process is you put this big grid up on a board or on a chalkboard or on a whiteboard, and you just open freely. Start with the first box in the first corner. What do we say about ourselves? What do we say about our issue? And you fill that box in with every bullet point you can think of. No idea is a bad idea. Someone shouts out something, you write it down. The importance is to get words on the board. Then once you feel you've exhausted that block, you move to the second block just below it on the left. What are we saying about them? Them are the people who might work against your issues. Them are the people who would say, I think you've got a good idea, but I as a state legislator would never fund it. Them are funders who are looking at you but not quite sure if they want to put support and resources behind your issue. Them are people who are outright opposed. They think that your idea, your advocacy, your issues just won't be good for their community or their state. What do they say about you and your issue? And you throw out everything you can think of that they might say. Moving up to the top right, what are the people who are opposed to your issue, skeptical of it, or not quite supporting it yet? What are they saying about themselves? How do they characterize themselves? And you want to write down everything you think they might say about themselves, whether it be what you've heard, what you've read, or what you think. And then finally, what are they saying about us? I mix that up here. What are they saying about us? Take the thing I said secondly and apply it to this box. You want to know what they're saying about you and why they be opposed to your issue. Going back to the fourth block on the bottom left, what are they saying about themselves? Write that down as well. Once you have all four of those blocks filled, as I've closed out here, you will have the beginning of your message box, and you will know that because remember the story I told you to start the story in Oklahoma? Well, everything we said there benefits all children, proven solution. You cannot improve K through 12 without strong pre-K. That started out in a message box, just like you see here. And through the weeks, we met again and again and refined our points down and chose the words we thought were most impactful, chose the words that were easiest to digest and repeat, and refined that down till we created our core messages. So that's how the four elements of effective messaging, that's how you start your messaging. And folks, I want to thank you for your time here today. And we look forward to continuing this part of Camp Prosperity. I know I've enjoyed it. Vanna or Justin, back to y'all.
Great. Thank you so much, Don, for laying the foundation there as we talk about messaging. I want to shift a little bit to still talk messaging, but to highlight a resource that I recently created along with my colleague here at Prosperity Now, Yumhee Park, and that is a values-based messaging resource. And I'm going to drop it in the chat here for you all in a second to take a look at this resource. It was also linked in your newsletter. But it came about because one of the issues that we often hear at Prosperity Now, in my seat that I sit in doing advocacy, we hear it often from our state-based advocates, is that it can be really difficult to connect with some legislators when your agenda tends to be more progressive leaning. So in response to that problem that we were hearing over and over again, last fall we convened a working group of state-based advocacy leaders from across the country. There were about 12 people. And we took some time over the course of about 3 months to discuss messaging and uncover some of the values that we thought could connect to the issues that we care about, some of the values that we thought were really important to our legislators and that we could begin to speak to open the door to begin to talk about some problems and solutions. We had the working group think through things like, what is the language of your community? What are some common beliefs or principles held by members of your geographic community? What values are legislators neglecting by not addressing certain issues in your community? So over the course of the next few slides, I'll discuss what came out of this working group and ultimately went into this resource that we'll be sharing with you all in the chat, or that you can find on the Prosperity Now website. But we started out by developing just a shared understanding of core values and what they are. And so you can see there on the screen, we define core values as some deeply held values and beliefs that drive people's actions or attitudes. Or if you want to think of it more simply, people's core values are their internal why. And so we sort of grounded this values-based messaging work around speaking to people's internal why, or just having that shared understanding of what core values were. And I think one of the other things that we began by talking about was just some of the core values that we thought everyone within the economic justice space sort of focused on or could agree upon. So things like equal opportunity, community, dignity, or fair treatment, some of those things that really come to mind when we think about the work that we do. So as we're talking about values-based messages on the next couple slides, I want you all to think about the work that you do and begin to drop in the chat some values that come to mind that drive you to do the work that you do. And so I know that as advocates, we tend to think in terms of issues and policies. It's something that we work on every day. It's our day to day. And so it can be natural for us in our messaging to reflect that, to talk about specifically the issues and policies. But when we're trying to connect with legislators and other stakeholders, like people in the community, we have to begin in a place of agreement, and that's around our shared values. And so by appealing to more fundamental values, we let people know why they should care and what's at stake, rather than just leading with the issues. We know that people are constantly bombarded. If we go on social media, we're constantly bombarded about the issues of the world. And so the way that you kind of break through that compassion fatigue is to frame your messages around some of those fundamental principles that you can keep at the forefront. And so to illustrate this, I've broken down the popular message box, not to be confused with the message box that Don just shared a few slides ago, but this is a message box that is recommended by an organization called Public Works. You can see at the beginning, the vision is sort of this broad, what do we want to see in the world? Kind of what is this ultimate solution that we want to see, this sort of ultimate harmony. Followed by that is values, which is again the why, and that's where I want to start from. Or that's where we started from in this resource, is focusing on value. Why does this thing matter? Why does housing matter? Why should we invest in the future of our children? What internal beliefs really drive the need for this? And then the problem, of course, is what you're ultimately trying to address. So some of the things that you're seeing in your community that you're trying to address. And then the solution is the outcome that you're trying to achieve. And so in this section of the values-based resource, and I'm going to, throughout this, just call on you all to go and read that for yourself, because I realize I don't have a lot of time before our panel discussion. But we focused a lot on emphasizing the need for values-based messaging before we can begin to talk about solutions or drive home solutions-based messaging. And so when trying to drive change, as you'll see on the screen, we should appeal to the big ideas that we intuitively understand and agree on, rather than the issues and the wonky details that sometimes we as advocacy folks can lead with. And so after we talked about just sort of the need for values-based messaging and where values fits into messaging, one of the things that was really, really neat in this work, and you'll see in the resource that we've shared in the chat here, is that we sort of reworked Maslow's 5 categories of needs. One of the issues that we ran into in our working group was that we were thinking about financial security way too broad. We were trying to ascribe values to issues of financial security, but we realized that we were thinking about it just way too broadly. And so we decided to take a step back and just look at the full path that leads to long-term financial stability. So starting with basic necessities and where you go from there, the steps that are taken to where people ultimately achieve that path to prosperity, or ultimate long-term financial stability, as we refer to it in this work. And so at the base, you'll see basic necessities such as food, shelter, and clothing. Once individuals have acquired these basic needs, the need for safety must be fulfilled. So things like job security, health. From there, there's a sense of belonging to one's community, followed by the need to contribute to one's community. And then finally, at the top of the hierarchy is this path to prosperity, or as I mentioned before, long-term financial security. So as you're thinking about messaging work, and as you were thinking about reworking your message to lead with values, you can also think about the issues from the perspective of an individual's needs and where they think on this, or excuse me, where they land on this hierarchy, and begin to develop your messaging just strictly around that respective need as an individual. And so after we sort of looked at Maslow's hierarchy, we as a group decided, let's think through what values individuals, let's develop a list of values that individuals, values that might show up in each stage of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so for instance, for the need for basic necessities, some of the core values that we came up with were dignity, a right to life, equality, and fairness. Those are the things that come to mind when we think about why people need basic necessities. From there, we looked at values that we could ascribe to safety. Things like stability, physical and mental well-being, stronger communities. Those are the things that we think about when we say, well, why do people need job security? Why do people need healthcare? They need this stability. They need physical and mental well-being. Those are the values that we sort of ascribe to it. When we think about belonging, some of the core values that we came up with were purpose and harmony and healthy ecosystems. Why do people need to feel like they belong to a community? Because we value purpose. We value the harmony that comes along with strong communities. When we looked at esteem, some of the values that came to mind were self-determination, generosity, and community building. Again, when you think about why the need to contribute to society, why do we need to make sure that people are not only getting by, but getting ahead to contribute to society? Because there's a sense of purpose in that. And so we can get back to core values before we can even begin to talk about issues. And then finally, under self-actualization or path to prosperity, some of the core values that we came up with were individual will or self-sufficiency or freedom. There's a certain amount of freedom that comes into play when you have established financial security or a path to prosperity. And so you can see on the screen here, I don't want to take too much time as we read it, but the one thing to take away from this exercise that we did on Maslow's hierarchy is that our values can tend to shift as we're motivated to fulfill different needs. And so the core values that drive one's belief that individuals should have those basic rights to necessities, that can differ from those values that drive one's belief in individuals' inherent desire to prosper. So just think of that as you're moving ahead in your messaging as well, that values certainly shift as you go up the hierarchy. And the last thing I'll share here before I open it up for questions is it's important to not only understand the hierarchy of human needs, but also how decision makers tend to approach these needs when addressing household financial security. As I mentioned earlier, when we were putting together this resource, one of the things that we really wanted to answer as we thought about messaging around the issues is what values are at stake if pressing issues are not addressed? What values are legislators abandoning by not addressing affordable housing, by not addressing tax fairness? And so in that, we were able to shift from establishing a shared understanding of what our core values were to looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how values tend to shift to ascribing values to certain issues. And so I have a little example here on the right that I'll just read aloud here. And this is a very basic example, obviously around housing, but obviously your messaging will be much more thorough than this. But if we're looking at just from the perspective of basic needs, we can say that all people should have access to basic necessities like housing. Not basic needs. If we're looking at what needs we're fulfilling, we'll say all people should have access to basic necessities like housing. And the values that we're ascribing to the basic necessities like housing provide a sense of dignity or stability and are a human right. And as we're thinking about the issues that we are addressing, we say that we must ensure that every person has a safe, affordable place to live. Now, why do we want people to have a safe, affordable place to live? So that they can feel a sense of dignity, so that they can feel a sense of stability, because it's a human right. And so hopefully that gives you a sense of sort of where you move along in the path to talking, from talking about values to issues. But again, we went into much more detail in our values-based messaging resource. I know that I'm getting a prompt here to move us along to questions in the panel, but I did want to introduce this resource to you all, encourage you to look it over. It's in the chat there for you. Look it over and use it in your work as you are engaging legislators and developing messaging. And so with that, I'm going to ask a quick question here before we move along into our panel discussion. Don, I know that there was a question for you earlier, and I want to ask it and get a quick response here before we move along here. Let me find that question. Give me just a second here, Don.
No problem.
I thought I had it on my screen. Don, the elevator pitch that you shared earlier, can you share tips on how to be that prepared at all times?
Well, I think the easy thing to remember is what I said towards the end. It's everything that Vanna has talked about here, especially the importance of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, understanding what audiences need when you speak to them. It's not as if you just create messaging and it just exists. You have to not filter it. You have to interlace it into everything that you do. So if you write a funding proposal, you're applying for a grant, make sure your messaging is in there. If you write a statement to something that develops locally, elements of your messaging have to be in there. So the shortest way to answer that question is you start off first by saying, we're going to create materials, messaging materials that can be used in every type of setting, whether we're speaking it or writing it. And I think if you start out with that goal, it will help you like, okay, we got to go back and do this again because it needs to be refined. That would be the first thing that I would say. Consider your audience and make sure that what you're creating can be used in multiple avenues.
Great, thank you, Don. And so at this time, I will move us along here to begin our panel discussion here. And I'm going to ask our panelists to come on screen here. We've got, I know that Justin introduced them all, and I'll have them, before they answer their questions, to just introduce themselves briefly and talk about the work that they do. But I want to just go ahead and dive into the questions. And like I said, panelists, before you all answer the first question, if you'll just give a brief introduction of the work that you all do. And so the first question that I have here is just a very basic question around messaging that tends to come up a lot with our advocates is just how can local, state, and national groups get attention for their work? We know that we live in an era and a time where there's just so much noise out there. And so how can folks get attention, and then how might these tactics differ on the local, state, and national level? And I'll start with you, Kelly.
Thank you. So briefly say a little bit more about myself. So I'm Kelly Garcia. I am the Director of Policy at the National Institute for Reproductive Health, where I work on reproductive health rights and justice issues. And we are a national organization, but I work primarily supporting state organizations, which is what I've done largely throughout my career, but in a lot of different places. And so you're going to hear me talk a little bit more today. Kind of my examples will come a little bit more from my previous position at Ideas 42, which is a behavioral science organization that uses behavioral science for social change. And I was the director of policy there and worked on more economic justice issues as well. And so with that preface, just give you a little bit of background where I'm coming from and where some of my examples are coming from, I can get started answering the question, which I'm going to have to like totally remind myself. So I will also say, as I noted, I work for a national organization, and I've worked with national organizations primarily, but my work really focuses on thinking about how we can support local and state advocates. And so my answer here will focus a little more on the local and state side of this question, rather than as much on the national side. And so part of my first kind of thing, I have my 3 things, which is kind of be really creative. When we're learning to be loud, think about how you're passing the mic to the various other people that can speak up, and think who your trusted messengers are, so that you can not just passing the mic, but who are people going to really be listening to. And so when we think about creativity, that for local and state groups in particular, you can really be truly creative, right, in the kinds of things that you want to do. And when you're being creative in how you're going to kind of be loud and get attention, and that's also a way to kind of think about how to do these things without necessarily costing a lot of money, or kind of doing the things that national organizations, have infrastructure and all of those things to do. So the picture I picked that I liked there was sidewalk chalking, because literally that's an option, right? So you have an issue that you are thinking about, again, kind of check your laws before you do this, but like a creative option, right, is to go in front of your local offices for your decision makers, go in front of the state capitol, go in the places where people are going to see you, and chalk out your messages, right? And that also kind of gets you to the kind of passing the mic. You do not have to just do chalk, but that is definitely something people do. That's definitely a way of kind of being creative and getting attention, and that can, both like if your legislators have to walk past it or your decision makers have to walk past it, your school board, whoever you're targeting, they will literally see it. But also, press will literally see it as they're walking into the building. And that's a way to kind of, that's one way to kind of get attention. And, you can think about other kinds of things like that are just, how do you get yourself in front of the legislators, in front of your decision makers, and how do you get yourself in front of the media and press so that way they're going to pay attention to you. And involving kind of artistic endeavors is also a really good way of thinking about how to involve your constituents and your clients and getting them involved in, again, it doesn't have to be chalking, but there's all sorts of, you can do murals, and you can do, speak outs, and you can make sure people are, speaking out at events, or talking at when you have local community fairs and all of those kinds of things. Have that moment to kind of to speak up, get your materials out there. How are you going to interest and activate people in listening to you? And then my second point, which I think is really important, is kind of pass the mic, but really think about how are you involving your constituents, your members, and other activists in being loud and getting their voices heard. And part of this can include making sure you're doing trainings and materials for like whoever it is that you want to get involved and have that opportunity to speak up. And so you can have trainings, you can create materials, you can think about, you're going to have this great resource on values-based messaging. You can think about, how do I take something like that and adapt it to provide some background and resources and materials for my clients, or for our constituents, or for the activists that are our grassroots activists that are really interested and engaged. And you can also kind of do all sorts, you can do trainings. You can do trainings for people on how do you write letters to the editor? What's the best strategy to do that? How do you provide testimony, whether that's testimony at your state legislator's office, or if it's testimony to your local school boards, or at your planning meetings, right? If you're thinking about housing, what are the kind of community meetings that are happening where you need to show up and talk about the housing issues in your area? And you can do trainings for people on how to provide that testimony. You can also do trainings and kind of arrange for people to show up and talk directly to their policymakers. It can be, doing lobbying days or having those meetings, but also having kind of in-district meetings as well and setting that up. I know I'm in Virginia. People have, there's a lot of opportunity. People think sometimes like, oh, it's really scary to go talk to my legislator, or it's really scary to go talk to staff. But really, or it's, even like it's scary to go talk to my supervisor. But like they are out there in the community. Staff is going to be there. There's, our school board members have like kind of regular meetings at my local library. You can show up to those, but you can also do trainings to help your clients and all the people you're working with show up to those things. And the other thing I will say, as I noted in my kind of intro, is I work for a national organization and our goal is to support local and state groups. And so I might be saying this, you're like, but I don't know how to do this myself. Well, that's fine, because there are lots of other organizations that are out there that can help set up these trainings and do these kinds of things. NARH, for example, does media trainings for reproductive rights in groups. And at Ideas 42, I helped organize a whole set of work to help to bring in people to think about, like, they were thinking around housing in the Bronx. So had kind of whole conversations, first identifying policies that they were interested in, and then from there kind of doing trainings on how do we take those policies that you're interested in, and then let's turn that into talking points and materials so that you can set up and start having your meetings with your constituents. And those, again, that was us as a national organization coming in and trying to support other groups. And so those things are all available. And then the final thing I will say is just, you also can kind of engage your trusted messengers. And so both the public and policymakers often listen to trusted messengers so those are people that you kind of like think, oh, when they speak, you really want to listen to them and you believe them. And there's like, we'll have a question down the road around message testing and polling to identify who your trusted messengers are. For me, in working in reproductive health and rights, the trusted messengers are often healthcare providers, so doctors and nurses. But I think that's also true for things like particularly pediatricians. I've worked a lot on the child tax credit. Having pediatricians weigh in can be incredibly helpful. Having economists weigh in on child tax credit was also kind of a powerful way, because they're kind of like, it's these people who are disinterested in the politics side of things, but can speak from a space of expertise, right? So kind of bringing both sets of those things can be really helpful. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm going to move us along here to our second question in the panel, and that's how do you form relationships with individuals or outlets that can amplify your message? And Don, I think this might be right down your alley, so I'm going to call on you to respond here, and then Sarah, obviously chime in. Kelly, if you all have thoughts as well.
Well, I'll start off quickly by piggybacking on something Kelly said to end her remarks just now, is about amplifying your own personal message. One of the ways you're able to do that is you got to have something to say. A lot of times when we're advocating for progressive issues, we think the most important goal is to provide the right answer. And that's not really always been the experience of my career. You've got to have something to say. We're advocates. We're pushing for an issue. It's not about every time we're questioned it's a quiz and we have to provide the right answer. We're trying to move an issue. We're trying to improve neighborhoods, improve communities. So I would say one of the ways you can form relationships with individuals or outlets, I'll give 2 examples. If you want to form relationships with reporters, number one, even if you're local, whether you're in a local community or at the state level, if you don't have a communications person, that's still no excuse for not knowing who the local reporters are who cover your issues. And that's both print, radio, television, and podcasters and bloggers. These folks can be found online. They can be found on news apps. They can be, just keep a list of those folks. Many of their stories either contain direct listings of their emails, or more directly, they can contain direct listings of their social media. If you're trying to meet folks in the community to move your issue, think of non-traditional settings that you may not have thought of. If you're an organization that has been a convener of other organizations, maybe it's time to take a closer step out into the community. Also, I know that if it's social media being so prevalent, community message boards, I know in the community I live here in Washington, D.C., we have a robust Facebook page. And from there, our ANC commissioners started providing updates, and other advocacy groups started providing updates. And now, before meeting them on their website or even meeting them on their own specific social media pages, we go to the community page to find out what the mayor, what our ANC commissioner, what our council members are saying. And we don't go to their website. We don't go to their specific pages. We go to our own community pages. So make sure you contribute to those.
I want to apologize. I have a train that's coming right behind my my office window, so there may be a little bit of background noise. But again, I'm Sarah Miller. I'm Senior Policy Analyst with Hope Policy Institute. Hope is a Black and women-owned financial institution, and it includes, our family of institutions includes a regional credit union, a community development financial institution, loan fund, and a policy center. And I'm situated in the policy center. We're dedicated to strengthening communities, building assets, and improving lives in the Delta and other economically distressed areas of Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee. And as far as building relationships with sort of local outlets and local stakeholders and policymakers, for us, it really comes down to being in community in the places that we work. In some of the places like small towns throughout the Mississippi Delta, our branches are the only financial institution in town, like the one in a little small town called Itta Bena, Mississippi. and our branch staff live and work in the Delta and are along with our members in the communities we serve. So for local stakeholders, policymakers, our relationships are built that way. And then for more national stakeholders and reporters, I think it's really about building relationships in the background over time, even before you have this big policy push, or urgent message. Make yourself a resource to them on your areas of expertise. Send them resources, even if you're not quoted in an article all the time or at first. And to reiterate something Dawn said about social media, for me, Twitter engagement has been really key to get to know reporters. And so that's what I would suggest.
Thank you both. And I'm going to move us along to question 3. I think these questions are kind of building off of one another. And I know we only have about 10 minutes left before we go to Q&A, so I want to make sure we get through these. Kelly, I'm going to turn it back over to you. And as speaking of relationships, we're just thinking about what the relationship looks like from advocacy to media to policy change. And just why each of these systems matter or not. And I know you had some, based on your experience with Ideas 42 in your current role, had some things to share here. So Kelly.
Thank you. So I think I have the slide that has all of these things. So I will just first say, I think all of the things matter in order to get us to policy change. When we're thinking about trying to get to policy change, what we really need are the decision makers and policy makers who either and can both believe in the change that we want, or at least believe that voters are going to hold them accountable if they don't make that change. And the reality is, a lot of times what we actually need is some combination of that. We can't just get movement with just the true believers. We need some set of true believers, some set of people who may not be true believers, but at least think they're going to be held accountable, and maybe some people who are being brought along because of other kinds of negotiations that have happened. And so to really do that, I think you need, and this slide, I have kind of all the arrows going in one direction. That's not really how I would have done it if I had better skills. But to really get this, right, we need to have public engagement. That's part of the holding people accountable. It's both holding people accountable space, that we have the public saying, hey, we believe in this policy. And so we believe in this policy and we want this policy. Both tells our decision makers that we're going to hold them accountable if they don't act on this policy. But it also is actually a way to move people, right? When you hear everybody, and Dawn has said this, like, you need a story to tell. And, we have all the statistics and we have data, and I am a firm believer in statistics and data, but at the end of the day, it's stories and people's personal stories that actually change people's minds. And so having public engagement, people who are speaking to the policymakers about their experiences, and that is a thing that can also change real hearts and minds. And then we also really need to have advocates. Advocates who are also doing all the same things, who are lifting up the public engagement piece of it, are showing how you're going to be accountable, and are similarly telling the story. And then it's always helpful to have the media picking up on these stories and narratives as a way to kind of push your decision makers. Now, I said kind of all of that, but ultimately, what we're really trying to do, like when we're engaging the public engagement, and we're engaging our advocates, and we're engaging the media to try to push them on the policymakers to get that change, it's really trying to change the narrative around the story, right? We want to get our narrative and our story out there. And so we're doing all of that in the process, in the service of getting policy change. And I'm just going to quickly take an example. I'll try to do this really fast because I know we're short. I know we're like on time. But right now we're hearing a lot about work requirements. And there's a lot of move to push work requirements onto benefits programs. Now, I will tell you, we all know this, work requirements don't work. They just create sludge is the word that's coming to mind. That's not what I meant, but they create burdens that keep people who are otherwise eligible from getting the benefits that they deserve, keeps them from being able to engage in those benefits. And they but they come from a place, right? The reason people, you know, even people who you usually think might be with us believe in kind of work requirements because they have a narrative. They have a story about what it means for people who are living in scarcity, who are experiencing poverty. They have a story, but we have a story too that we want to tell. And we want to get that story out there to explain those things I said, right? I can cite you all sorts of data. I can tell you that the majority of people who get Medicaid actually are already working. I can tell you all of those things. That data, it doesn't matter, right? It matters. I mean, not true. It matters a little bit, but like what we really need is to kind of get the story and kind of to change that narrative. And so we want to think, what's the positive narrative that we want to get out? What's the story? Well, one of the stories I think we want to get out is the fact, what I just said, right? People who get Medicaid, people who are getting a lot, who need to participate in these benefits programs, people who need help paying for housing, most of those people are already working. And if they're not working, there's a good reason why they aren't working. So you want to get the narrative, that narrative out there, the stories out there about people who are hardworking people, people who need a little help to get through a hard time. You want to do that while we're tapping into our values. We, as a country, think that everybody deserves opportunity. We, as a country, believe in this, and yet that's not what's happening, right? So you want to change, you want to get your narrative out there, change it in a way that engages the public so that the public can come along with you and they're going to start telling those stories, that gets advocates telling those stories, that gets decision makers believing those stories, and gets in the media so that the media is telling that story. And when you can get all of those things together, we can get policy change.
And I wanted to pause here to see if either Sarah or Don wanted to chime in, but thank you, Sarah, for breaking that down, just sort of that process to getting us to policy change.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. That kudos to the answer.
Yeah. All right, well, I'll move us along. Next question that I had for you all is, what are some strategies that you've used for lifting up the voices of those most impacted by bad policy? I know that's one way I think that people often struggle with messaging is to not appear, sorry, there's a particular phrase that I was trying to think of as I was teeing this question up, but I can't think of it, but not to appear just sort of like you're taking advantage of these families who have been impacted by bad policy, but really being intentional about the way that you're lifting up these stories. So Don, I'll start with you and see if you had some of those strategies, and then Sarah, Kelly, if you all have things, chime in as well.
Sure. Well, I'll say the first strategy is that we have to, as a movement, no matter what we're advocating for specifically, and Sarah certainly mentioned this earlier when she talked about being involved in the local community and having stories and knowing about the needs of their local customers. We have to be committed to telling these stories. What we know is for those people who are opposed to our work, who are opposed to our movements, they are certainly out there telling their stories. They talk about the struggles of the banker who doesn't get enough tax write-offs this year. They talk about the struggle of the wealthy family who, can barely afford their second lake house in another state. We need to be telling stories about what low-income families are facing daily, and we need to make sure that those are the stories that lead in on all types of mediums. If we don't tell the story, the other side will, and it will not be to our advantage. Facts do not often win the argument, and politics at the state and national level have proven that the candidate who has the most facts does not often win. The candidate who tells stories. And I'll end with one specific example of the group, advocacy group, that I think has done it the best as far as telling stories in my career, and that's the group Moms Rising. When I worked with them 12 or 13 years ago, we did a press event with them on Capitol Hill here in DC, and we knew we were going to have about 3 to 5 reporters show up in addition to advocates and members of Congress and other folks from the community. And the reporter said, after we spoke, our leaders spoke on the dais, telling about what we needed in Congress, telling about what we needed in policy. And the reporters came up and said, "This is great. Do you have any examples of people who are suffering from the things you say are going on?" And Moms Rising had a complete booklet available electronically by password for reporters, and then a physical printed book at our press conference that had a map of all the mothers that were in their network, and then a star in those states where people were available to speak. And then as you turned the page in that document, it had listed alphabetically by state 2 stories from each state with the person's first name and the city they were in, just telling a 2-paragraph story of how maternal and child health was important, why childcare was important. And then reporters knew they could work through Moms Rising to contact those folks. And it was a managed process. Not enough of our groups, not enough of our nonprofits have this type of setup, because the other half of winning is telling the story. It's not always the research.
And I'll just add, for Hope, this is really at the crux of what we do. We don't have a policy agenda that's separate or that's over and above what our members need and what they're experiencing. We have 25 branch locations and 37,000 members, so that's a lot of stories we have. And I'll just tell a really quick one, an example. I mentioned Itta Bena, Mississippi earlier in our branch there. The year we opened that branch, and we were the only financial institution physically located there, this was in 2015, and Miss Fanny Dotson had her 100th birthday that year. And with her birthday money from her children and grandchildren, she opened an account at Hope Credit Union. And it was her first ever bank account. So telling her story allows us to talk about the experiences of people who are unbanked or underbanked and the impact of having physical branches in underserved communities. The other thing I'll say is, we've had really great success with not just taking our messages to policymakers, but bringing them and convening events where we bring them to us and to meet our members. We had also in Itta Bena, we had an event where Chairman Jerome Powell of the Federal Reserve spoke, and got to see a lot of Itta Bena. Vice President Harris came to Greenville and she gave a big speech, but before that she had visited a fabric store that had gotten a loan from Hope, and they had connected over their love of sewing. And we brought the Secretary of HUD to Jackson, and just recently had the Black Home Ownership Collaborative in Memphis and had the director of FHFA there. So that's another thing, that if you can bring some of your stakeholders to you and to your messengers, that's a good way for them to see firsthand what's going on.
Thank you both. 2 great examples there of lifting up the voices of those most impacted. 2 more questions that I have for you all as a panel, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for their questions. So audience, if you have questions, continue to put them in the questions chat and I'll answer them in a few minutes here. But question for you, Sarah, because I know that you're down at Hope Policy, which is in Mississippi, I believe, but your region focuses on a lot of southern states, so I think this will be really relevant for you. But wanted to know, when we talk about just values-based messaging and things like that, how have you been able to message in ways that build bridges? We know that we live in a very polarizing political environment, and so it can be difficult at times to develop some of that messaging that sort of lends itself to folks from both sides of the aisle, so to speak. So just wanted to get your thoughts on some messaging that builds bridges. Excuse me.
Sure. I really liked your resource, and it speaks to a lot of what we think about when we think about building bridges, is really centered on values. And as I mentioned before, using the experiences of our members really gives us a platform to talk about those things in a very real, impactful way. But we also do have to think about not just the messaging, what we focus on, but also the messengers. So, the South is also called the Bible Belt, and there's a lot of people who consider their faith to have a lot to do with their political beliefs. And you know, in Memphis, we have started the Black Clergy Collaborative. That's a lot hard for me to say. Well, so we have churches all over Memphis that work on payday lending, fighting predatory lending. And, you know, in some cases, you know, we really do a lot of work on racial equity, and that can be tricky, not just in the South where we live, but everywhere. But in some cases, that means, you know, we have a coalition of 6 CDFIs throughout the country that work on persistent poverty in rural areas. It's called Partnerships for Rural Transformation. So there are a lot of issues that the poor Black folks in the Mississippi Delta have that are common with the folks that FAHI, and one of our partners, serve in Appalachia. So, you know, if we focus on rural persistent poverty and focus on geographies like persistent poverty, that also ends up addressing racial equity because of who lives in our persistent poverty areas. But I'll also just want to push back a little bit from the idea of, you know, always making hot button issues backseat. You know, I think there are some times where you can sort of push the envelope a little bit, and there are all of the times that you want to not put on the back burner a message or value that, like equity, that is, you know, core to who you are.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. And I think that echoes something that Don mentioned earlier. I don't know if he called it exclusivity or something along that lines of just sticking to it, what it is that you do and what you're focused on as an organization. Final question here before we get into audience questions. I will turn it over to Kelly to talk a little bit about this. I know that we started the Camp Prosperity series talking about data and research, and want to sort of build off of that and talk about messaging and how the two play off of each other. So how have you used research tactics like polling to drive your messaging and make policy recommendations?
Thank you. So this is a little bit of a messy slide, but well, first, I just want to say, I do want to draw just a quick distinction between kind of polling and research and message testing. So if you think about polling and research, that's where we're trying to really get to the true answer, trying to find out what it is people need, what is it they want, what it is they actually believe. And so an example, kind of polling / research, was work that we did on the child tax credit with CLASP and Ipsos in partnership with several other organizations that specifically looked at how, like, low and moderate income, what low and moderate income families' experiences were with the child tax credit. So there was some polling to think about, like, what were their attitudes towards the CTC, but also like probing questions about what were their experiences, did they know about it, how did they sign up for it, and that could be used to create, both tell us as advocates what we should be doing to get the message out and get information to people about the child tax credit so that they could actually be using it effectively, but also to take to decision makers and policymakers, including the IRS, on like what they should be doing, both to get the word out, but also to make the process easier. And then to take to legislators to tell them, like, here's the policy changes that we actually need, right? So that's kind of one way that we use kind of research and polling to move to kind of inform what our policy decisions should be. And then that's a little separate from kind of message testing, which is trying to figure out, I know what policy I want. I know that I want to have a child tax credit that's extended and fully refundable, but how am I going to talk about it in a way that's going to resonate across the board, right? Like, how am I going to talk about it that's going to bring the public along? How am I going to talk about it that's maybe going to bring, you know, bring some Republicans along, bring people who might not otherwise support it? What's our messaging around that? And so just really quickly to talk about, so how do you use both kind of that combo of messaging, message testing and policy and polling and research? You can like use that clearly to kind of just develop what are the messages, what are the things we're going to talk about. But also you can use it to tell people, you know, let people, for example, know that they're not alone. We know from a lot of research that people often think, you know, I'm the only person who does X, Y, or Z, or I'm the only person who believes that. And so they don't feel like they can act on those beliefs, or they can't act on that experience. And so if you have data or information that says, you know, you may be surprised to learn that X percentage of people have actually used some form of public benefits in their lifetimes. That could help people who might feel ashamed about having felt public benefits be like, oh, actually lots of people use that and there's a good reason for it, right? So it kind of can show that people aren't alone. Similarly, in that kind of statement, you can like use the data to reinforce values. So when you say X number of people have done this, or X number of people believe this, that when you're thinking about the kind of values-based messaging, we in this country don't, you know, believe that everyone should have the opportunity, and then you back that up with some data so that you're reinforcing those values that are getting people to where you want to go. And then kind of what we started out at the top of the conversation was thinking about how we're demonstrating support. So if we're talking both to policymakers or to, again, the general public or the media to kind of get that narrative change, you know, did you know 80% of people in the United States support the child tax credit? That tells your decision makers that, again, to the accountability, that you're going to be held accountable if you don't vote in this way. But it also helps garner that story in the media to try to push the media to tell that story about how people are very supportive of this proposal. And I did not say this, but I am totally making up all the numbers. So do not quote any of the numbers that I just said. And then the other thing, one of the things that has been really powerful, particularly with your more progressive voters at the moment, where there's a lot of anger and frustration, is to kind of identify outliers. And so again, like my made up 80%, 80% of people support the child tax credit. Therefore, so-and-so who's not supporting it is out of step with the American people, right? So you can kind of push that outlier, and that can also push and garner support. And that relates to kind of, again, like how we're holding people accountable. When you say voters support this, and then you remind voters that you support this, it helps hold their policymakers accountable when you're thinking voters are going to remember this, right? When they go back when they are casting their votes. So think about what your vote is, because they're going to remember this when they vote down the road. So that was like super fast, and I'm happy to kind of answer more if there are more questions, like thinking about how we're using polling and research in the Q&A.
Super fast, but extremely helpful in answering the question. So thank you so much for that, Kelly. I think that is one of the things when we surveyed people on what they wanted to know about in the Camp Prosperity series, that was something that we saw a lot, is just kind of the ties between data and messaging. And when you're looking at data, what are you supposed to do with it? How am I supposed to tell the story of it? So that was a great response. I want to get into some audience questions. So panelists, please take a moment to grab a drink of water if you need to. I know I've been rapid fire asking you questions, but I'm going to move us along to some audience questions here. And we've got a few for you. So I'm going to throw out the first one. And it is, I believe Eleanor asked it a moment ago, but it is how does policy and law changes impact original core messaging? For example, the affirmative action policy. So just thinking about messaging needing to pivot or things like that, but just how policy and law changes impact your original messaging. And that's a great question from Eleanor.
I can start. This sometimes works to our advantage and sometimes to our disadvantage. We've had a lot of good wins federally over the past couple of years in our work, and that has given us sort of good momentum. And but yeah, there are other things like the court cases with affirmative action and some other court cases, not from the Supreme Court, but that sort of challenge the idea of making like race-specific funding decisions federally is an example of one. And so it does require us sometimes to change the focus of our messaging, like I mentioned before, focusing on persistent poverty geographies rather than race-specific metrics for funding or things like that.
I'll jump in really quickly. First of all, I think it took us a minute because Eleanor, we're supposed to ease in with easy questions first. Thank you for a question that really makes us think. I would refer back to, I'd say two things. I'd refer back to something Vanna said earlier in her presentation, talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I harp on that because that visual is a perfect representation. Every person, every group, every nonprofit, individual legislators or congressional bodies, they have needs that tie into their goals that they're trying to achieve. And I think when we have major decisions like what happened at the Supreme Court on affirmative action, or we have a Congress that won't move on the earned income tax credit, or they cut funding for a vital program which is moving children and families into the middle class, we have to, as nonprofit leaders, ask ourselves, with this decision, does it change the need of the community we're trying to serve or move? And does it change the needs of the people we're trying to attract to our movement, whether they be funders, advocates, and supporters, or journalists? And I think the question, the answers you get to those questions, whether it be at a staff meeting or just you sitting at your desk at your computer trying to put together an action memo on how you're going to move forward, will dictate whether or not your messaging will change. If you think realistically that this decision, which changes the perception or the efficacy of something like affirmative action or maternal and child health or EITC, changes the momentum around that issue, then ask yourself, does it change the messaging for the audience that you're communicating to? And I don't think we can answer that for you here, but if that does change, then so does your messaging have to as well. But I would hope it doesn't.
Thank you both for that. Hopefully this is an easier question, but I don't know, so I'm just going to ask it. We all know that, of course, not every organization, not every person represented on the call has their own communications team. And I think we wanted to ask this as a poll question, but didn't really have time. Any advice for folks who either have a small or non-existent communications team just to effectively promote their message?
Can I jump on this one first?
Sure.
I've been saying this to nonprofits at all levels, national, state, and local, for 25 years. If you don't have communications folks on your teams, and like most nonprofits, if you have staff, your staff is strapped, they're barely doing the jobs they were hired for because they're so busy. If you seriously want to bring communications members on your team, I always encourage this. If you have a community college or junior college in your area, and I know as soon as I say that, nonprofit folks are thinking, but Don, we don't have any money. Don't even say college, university. We have no money. You can think of it this way strategically. Find your local community college, county community college, or junior college. See if they have an English or a communications department, or English or communications professors. Figure out, go to their website, find those professors' emails, and reach out to them. Let them know about your organization. Give them your website and say, look, we know that there are students in your classes who are looking for experience. When we want to hire people at nonprofits I've worked for, the folks we wanted to hire aren't folks who submitted college papers. They're people who had actual writing samples from nonprofits and being out in a community. Say to that professor, do me a favor, we want to create a communications position here, and we'd like to have them work 15 hours a week. And we will offer in return work experience for them, the ability to draft materials, so they'll get real world work experience, and they'll be our key communication staffer reporting to X person at your nonprofit. And they will get work experience, and say to that professor, send me your top 3 students who you think are the best writers in your class or the best strategists in your class. And we will work with you to choose one of them, or maybe 2 of them, and they can become our communication staff. Work with your local junior colleges and community colleges, because there is a lot of untapped potential and professional folks who can help you in those classrooms, and they're looking for opportunities.
Can I hop in really quickly and just say, also take advantage of the other take advantage both of coalition building and what people can do, like what other organizations are able to do and able to share, because that's a way to kind of spread out the work. But also, if you're a local or state organization, think about how you are reaching out to and working with national organizations, because a lot of times, they might have communications toolkits that can be shared, and there's actually several, and different kinds of organizations that already have that's just their job, right? There are organizations that just have communications toolkits and communications tips and hints and things that you can go and you can pull from to kind of start shaping your message. And a lot of national organizations, seem they don't have things that are already kind of pre-prepared. If you're working on issues that are related to them, they can help you. Like, that's one of the things I used to do, and not just, I worked in repro rights, but I also did this on economic justice issues. Somebody would be like, hey, I'm going to talk to I'm walking in right now. Can you, send me some talking points on this bill? And I could write a bunch of talking points, or we'd be like, yeah, we can quickly pull together something for you to share on social media. So like, think about all the other places and all the other groups that might be doing this work, or might be, willing, and kind of that's part of what they do. It's to step in and help support smaller organizations and reach out to them, because there are lots of tools and resources. I almost never write my own, write talking points from scratch. I'm always pulling from somebody to kind of get them together. So you can, there's a lot of stuff out there to be helpful.
Thank you, Kelly. And I have one last question from our audience before I turn it over to some next steps and then announcing our social media winner. But just thinking about, and I'm just teeing this up before I ask the question, just thinking about all of the ways to amplify a message, social media, traditional media, all of the ways. How big or small is the role of social media in crafting a narrative around your policy? So I'm guessing just thinking about the role that social media plays in just a larger messaging strategy for an organization. What are your thoughts there?
I'll jump in first. I compare the work done on social media relative to your messaging. Think of it as an ocean, and we drop a stone in the ocean and all the ripples that go away from that stone, whether it's a large boulder or whether it's a small stone. That's how important social media is. You don't have to be the large boulder and have bandwidth and recognition like the United Nations social media page. You can be a small nonprofit and create ripples with your tiny stone by utilizing social media. And one of the first ways you should think about it is creating short videos, commenting on things that are happening in your state legislature, things that are happening in your local county council or city council. People, I said some words earlier, you got to say something. You don't want to step out of bounds and say something that's not been approved by your board or the leader of your organizations. But let's also remember, we are advocacy organizations. You've got to be emphatic. You've got to say something, because the people we are fighting for, if we don't exist, often they have no one fighting for them. And we've got one moment in time to do it. So yeah, social media is incredibly important and necessary.
I can have it completely co-sign that social media is really important, but also I'm a policy advocate. I hate tweeting, but I do. And one of the things that I used to do a lot more than I do now is I would just, I have to sit and watch hearings, right? I would be watching Texas, whatever, watch their hearing. I live tweet them. Well, live tweeting the hearings also helped me get my message out, but also means that reporters would start following me because they don't have to watch the hearing. They could be listening, reading my live tweets. And so things like that you can, again, you have to stay within the parameters and all the things, but there are things where you can kind of multitask your communications strategy along with whatever the policy, advocacy, or other work that you're doing that shouldn't be too heavy of a lift and doesn't require a separate comms team if you don't have one.
Awesome, thank you all for that. And I think, Don, what you said is really kind of a great way to end off this this conversation, and that's, you got to say something. And I think that's kind of what I want to leave. One of the things that I want to leave folks with is just not being afraid to get your voice out there and to begin the process of advocating and to begin to think about your messaging as an organization, raising up the things that you do, raising up the clients and the communities that you serve, and really not being afraid to engage legislators, because you really do have to start somewhere. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. This could have easily been 4 to 5 separate sessions on values-based messaging, on engaging media, on message testing, as Kelly talked about, on engaging folks, you know, who may be hostile politically, which I know Sarah encounters a lot. But we wanted to try to get that all into one webinar, and I just thank you all, our panelists, for the wealth of information that you shared. I've received a couple of several thanks in the chat, and just saying well done to you all as panelists for this session. And so I wanted to share you all's contact information with the audience, give them an opportunity to stay in touch, maybe follow up. Definitely want to encourage them to follow your organizations on social media, to connect with you all if they have additional questions. So I'll pause to make sure everyone sees that, and give folks an opportunity to screenshot it. And I think someone asked earlier, but yes, this PowerPoint presentation will be shared out after the webinar. And so the next thing that I have here, wanted to share some next steps with our audience as well. Please complete our survey. As we mentioned at the top of the webinar, we want to try to make this fun. By completing our survey, you'll be entered to win a small prize from us at Prosperity Now. So complete our survey. And speaking of prizes, I wanted to announce our Twitter winner for today's webinar, which is, I believe, Cash Campaign of Maryland. So whoever is tweeting from the Cash Campaign of Maryland account, please send your email, drop your email into the questions box. Prosperity Now staff will follow with you and send the prize. Again, that was Cash Campaign of Maryland. Whoever's tweeting from your account is our social media winner today. So thanks for tweeting using the hashtag Camp Prosperity. Also want you all to mark your calendar for our final Camp Prosperity webinar of the series. That's taking place on next Tuesday, a week from now. And we'll end this series talking about redefining your role as an advocate, owning imposter syndrome. We know that advocacy can feel big and scary to some people, especially if you're new to this, or if you live in those environments where politically things can be a little bit hostile. So want to talk, we will hear from some very experienced advocates on some work that they're doing, and hopefully answer a lot of questions that you have and provide you a lot of tips on how to break down some of the imposter syndrome that you may be feeling. And then lastly, I want to encourage you all to schedule those meetings with your legislator. As I mentioned, as Justin mentioned earlier, we will be awarding a prize, a Camp Prosperity registration to a person who has met with the legislator. So just a reminder to do that. Also, we encourage you to visit our Prosperity Now Advocacy Center. You can schedule a meeting with your legislator in our Advocacy Center. But you can also email a legislator, call a legislator, tweet at a legislator, all of that stuff. It's on our website. It's free to use for our advocates. So please take advantage of this resource to be able to contact your legislators on some of the issues that you care about and some of the issues that your organization is working on. And then finally, I want to invite you all to connect with Prosperity Now on a deeper level. If you are not a member of our Prosperity Now network, one of the things that we also want to do with Camp Prosperity is encourage you all to connect with one another, connect with individuals who are doing the same work that you're doing across the country. And one of the ways that you can do that is through our networks, Affordable Housing Network, our Campaign for Every Kid's Future network, our Financial Security Network, and then finally our Taxpayer Opportunity Network. We have listservs, we have working groups, we have steering committees, all of these different ways for you to get engaged and to connect with your peers across the country. And so finally, I just want to thank you all for joining us. I hope that you enjoyed this session and with our incredible speakers as much as I did, and I can tell you did just based on the feedback that we're getting in the questions and chat bots. So to Don, Sarah, and Kelly, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to share your expertise. We really appreciate it. And everyone have a great rest of your Tuesday and a great rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanna and Justin.